Thank you for coming. My name is Pat Wilds. I'm the director of the Government Law Center, who we're really fortunate to be putting on this event tonight with. But before I talk to you, more importantly, we have the Dean and President of Albany Law School, Cinnamon Carlarn, who, if you haven't heard, just got approved for another 5-year term here. So really thrilled to be working with her for not just now, but for the next half a decade as well, not longer. So, oh,
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Pat. I will be very, very short today, but I just have the privilege of welcoming you here. And first off, thank you. Thank you for being here in person, and thank you for being here virtually. I know it's a cold night, and we've all had a snowpocalypse and survived and gathered here together. When I first saw the title of the event tonight, Power and Policy on the Second Floor, I thought Pat might be talking about this office, and I realized very quickly that was not the case. But welcome to the conversation tonight, Power and Policy on the Second Floor, experts on the state of the state and executive budget in New York. I come to academia from a world working on environmental law and climate change law. And over the years, I moved from a focus on international law to increasingly focusing on state and local government. And there's a reason for that, because there's so much power and potential at the state and local level. And I think now more than ever, we're seeing that. We're seeing how important it is to really pay attention to what states are doing and to be involved in what states are doing. And in particular, a state like New York, which really is a hub. It's a hub for thinking about the impact that we can have locally, at the state level, and nationally. And one of the things that the Government Law Center is so integral to doing is thinking about how to make how to improve access to government. So we have transparency and understanding of the processes that take place. And tonight is a perfect example of that. And leading into tonight, I had the pleasure of reading Bennett Liebman's, or rereading rather, the New York State of the State Address, Time, Place, and Manner, which I know tonight's talk is kind of going to build off. And I have to tell you that these explainers and the things that come out of the Government Law Center are incredibly important because they create that access and that transparency, and they encourage engagement. And again, it's hard to imagine anything more important to engage with or to really even understand, because I think there's still a lack of rudimentary understanding of the way the budget works and the state of the state works. And so being able to engage in these conversations, particularly at this moment, I think is incredibly important. So I want to say thank you to the Government Law Center, not only for holding this program, but for the role it plays in helping us really think critically about New York State law. Now, before I turn it over, I do just want to say one other quick word of thanks, and that is to Pat Wiles, the director of our Government Law Center, because what he won't tell you when he says something about me serving half of a decade, which sounds a lot longer than 5 years when I hear that out loud, is that he has just completed his first year as the director of our fantastic Government Law Center. And under his leadership, it continues to thrive and play an essential role in our community. And so I'm so grateful to Pat and the entire staff of the Government Law Center made such a meaningful impact in our school and our community. So first, thank you to everybody for being here. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Pat to get this started with a big thanks.
thank you, Dean Carlarn. Before we get started, just a few logistical notes. The explainer document that the dean actually just referenced, we have some hard copies up here if you'd like to grab one, preferably after we're done today, but if you want to read it while we're here, that's up to you. We also have that all, of course, available virtually. A big thank you to our team, Mary Berry, who's here in front of us, one of our government lawyers in residence, Chell Miller, who's the brains and muscle behind everything that we do at the Government Law Center. Of course, the rest of our team who helped set up today, did things behind the scenes, and are probably monitoring remotely as well. They are the ones that really make this place work. Food and refreshments are to my right, your left. Please eat them. We have a number of students here. They will eat them if you don't. But until after the program, it's fair game for everyone. Don't worry, though. They won't go to waste. They will go over by the library, and they'll be gone very quickly after tonight's program. And then finally, we're going to go about an hour runtime. That's what we find people's attention span these days. If we go much more than that, we're losing everyone. So we'll go about an hour. We'll reserve about 15, 20 minutes after that for questions. If you're joining us online, you can submit them right in the chat, and Chell is monitoring those, and they'll send them along. If you have them in person, feel free to hold on to them, and we'll just kind of take them in the order that they come up. I'm sure you have more than we can get to, but we're excited to get to them. So jumping in, we're thrilled to be here. We did a lot of thinking about when to do this program because I remember Beth and I were texting and we're like, well, should we do it the night before the State of the State? And then there were 40 events that were happening. And then should we do it the night before the budget? Same thing. But January is really important when it comes to the executive branch, when it comes to New York State government. So we felt like as long as we landed now before the budget hearings get underway, and I guess they already started, right? Or yeah, they started today. So there's always something going on, right? But we think it's really important to get this in January because it really sets both of these events, the State of the State and the budget, really set the blueprint for the rest of the spring and really the entire government calendar. So to really get us going, I'm going to turn it to each of our wonderful panelists who you want to hear from a lot more than me. So each of you, maybe, you've worked for different administrations. In one case, one of you still works for an administration or now works again for an administration. Can you just share with the audience here who you are, who you worked for, and in what capacity you worked for all of them? Bob, I'll start with you to my right.
Well, hi. Thanks, Pat. Thank you, Dean, for putting this together. My name is Bob Bellafiore. I realized as I was thinking about this that this was the 40th State of the State that I have been paying attention to, either in somewhere from tremendously, like writing it, or not at all, like this one. So I guess I'm sort of a dinosaur in town, me and Mr. Bishop and Judge Malone here, and sit here and make petroleum for the future. I've been involved in, my experience with these has been first as a reporter covering government for the Associated Press. I will never forget a day during Mario's State of the States when we're in the AP office, hunkered down, the door is closed. If you've been in Albany more than 10 minutes, you know not to walk into the AP office when the door is closed. And one of my colleagues, Joel Stashenko, looks up and says, "This place is rotten with lobbyists." Which is sort of what the State of the State Day is like. Anyway, as a reporter covering several of them, then working for Governor Pataki for 8 years, I was the primary author on one of his State of the State addresses, as well as a contributor on many of the others, and part of the peanut gallery on the Mall, and also was the primary author of his budget speeches, which is, I think, is the other part of this conversation, is the executive budget process and how to tell that story. So that's, and then since I left government, as a consultant and chirper, and every now and then pundit on TV and radio.
Hi, Beth Garvey. Very happy to be here. Thank you, Dean and Pat, for hosting. So it's funny. I don't think of myself as an expert, but I'm catching up to Bob. This is my 21st State of the State and budget cycle. I joined the state legislature right out of law school, where, again, you're more in a responsive posture with respect to the state of the state and the budget, navigating through some very, sort of tricky legal issues. I got there right at the time of Silver v. Pataki being issued by the Court of Appeals. And that case continues to have a really large impact, outsized impact really on the state budget process. But I concluded my state government career with Governor Andrew Cuomo, working on 2 of his State of the State addresses and budgets. And I have now spent going on 4 years as one of those rotten lobbyists. So.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carrie Neifeld. This is, I guess, going in order, my 10th State of the State and budget that I've had a role of some sort, whether paying attention from an agency, contributing a little bit, up to, being, really involved. And this year, kind of like a spectator, but coming in back to government right afterwards. So I started as a social worker. I am a social worker. I started as a social worker doing direct service work with families and children across New York. Transitioned into government through one of the state's really wonderful fellowship programs, which I highly recommend to law students who can take advantage of that when you're done. And just through, kind of luck, or maybe not so lucky, I guess, wound up working in the governor's office under the previous governor, Andrew Cuomo. Spent, 5 years there, where Beth wasn't technically my boss, but she's like my forever boss. And did left for a little bit, but came back as a state agency commissioner of the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities, and then left there for a little bit. I had 3 kids in and around a lot of that, so took a break to be with my family, and just I think 9 days ago returned to state government, again working for Governor Hochul as the deputy director for state operations. So really very brand new in that role, but it's a role that feels a little bit like home, being back on the second floor. So
Great. Well, thank you all. And one thing I failed to mention earlier is that we actually have a lot of our wonderful Government Law Center fellows and Albany Law students here. So as to the panelists and to everyone else, just being mindful in what we're talking about, we're trying to catch them up quickly to how state government works. But if you're using an acronym, if you could try to remind them what it actually means, it'd be helpful. But we're all guilty of that. And, just quickly, because I guess it's relevant to me moderating, I also worked for 2 governors. I worked at the same time as Beth briefly with Governor Cuomo in a very different capacity doing FOIL work, which is, if you haven't done it, riveting work, but important in government, no less. And we're planning on teaching students about how to FOIL.
Pat, isn't it really easy just to say no?
Yeah, there you go. You got it. Yeah, it was a pretty easy job. They called me all hours of the day. But more relevant, and I didn't really work in the state at all in that capacity, but I worked for Governor Hochul for 3 years, which is how I got to know Kerry really well and worked on a lot of state of the states, mainly through the mental health lens and that policy lens. So the folks we have here today can speak about it even more broadly, which is wonderful. Before we get into some slightly more substantive questions, I think it would be really helpful for each of the 3 panelists to just, when you hear state of the state or executive budget, what's kind of the most common misunderstanding that you think that folks get when it comes to those speeches and how they come together? What's the most common misconception? It can be either or both. Carrie, I'll start with you.
Well, the most common misconception, I think a lot of people probably don't even know that they exist. So I think if you're not really kind of like in tune to this, and you're not a person who's paying attention to policy in Albany, and you're not really, to use your phrase, in Planet Albany, you might not even really pay attention to the state of the state, I think. And I think even less attention probably to the executive budget release. But I think a lot of times, and I think we got a little, we blended these things sometimes under Governor Cuomo. But I think a lot of times people think of the state of the state as the budget, or think of the budget as the state of the state, and don't necessarily, see the difference. And I think, too, I think the other thing, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about it throughout the panel, is that I don't think people understand how much power the executive has in the executive budget release, and that it really is, sort of, it's the blueprint that we work from, right, when we're negotiating the budget. And the houses have a lot of, say, and we have a lot of negotiation, right? But, it kind of always comes back to what did the executive put forward? And there's, very, strict rules, right, around what the legislature can and can't do with that document, which I don't think a lot of people understand. I think people think of budget negotiation as more of like an open negotiation.
Great. Beth?
Yeah, I would agree with Carrie. I think, because it has gotten sort of blurred from what you would think of that traditional sort of opening day speech that is focused on this is the state of our state, it has really gotten blended into these are my policy pronouncements and here's the budget. It all is kind of one and the same, because I think, as we now have an opening day of the legislature and a separate state of the state, and then very quickly thereafter an executive budget, you're sort of, dribbling out piecemeal a lot of these important policy objectives that the governor has. And, it really is part of this iterative process that sort of, stretches out throughout the spring. So I don't know, Bob.
Well, we'll talk about 2 worlds here. We'll talk about inside the 12-mile limit of Albany, where the state of the state is a huge thing for 10 minutes. And then governor makes a speech and the words go in the air, and the next day it's like Wednesday, right? In the real world, it's like yesterday was Tuesday, right? My kid got up, my kid got sick, I had to go to work, the bus was late, somebody's car on my block was broken into, right? It's like the real world, right? And then, so that's the state of the state, right? And inside Albany, everybody freaks out. Everybody, advocates, I will call them advocates now, advocates try for months to get their stuff mentioned somehow in the 57,000 word speech, right? And if they do, they can go back to their clients and go, we're in.
Look
Right.
at that footnote.
Right. Look at that footnote. Right. 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 She thought about this. It was in the word balloon. She didn't say the words, but it was in the word balloon. I could see it. I could tell. That's kind of the state of the state. The budget is a huge deal governmentally. It is a huge deal inside. I used to cover the budget for the AP. I was on it every day for weeks and days and months and weekends and the whole thing, right? Camping outside the governor's office. Mario had a leaders meeting one Saturday night on March 31st that went all night. And because I was at the AP, every other reporter went home except me, right? Because I was there. So it's like 7 o'clock in the morning and Mario Cuomo's having a press conference and I'm the only press there. Do you know how painful that is? Right? So, so the budget is a big deal internally. It is the roadmap for how the state's going to spend its money. But out in the real world, it's like how much of that filters through is infinitesimal. So when you see Sienna go out and poll what people think of the budget proposals, it's like, why don't you ask people what they think of Alpha Centauri's makeup? Like they're not paying attention. So why are you bothering? Why are you bothering asking? So there's inside Albany, where everybody is doing this sort of stuff inside the government industrial complex. And then there's in the real world when nobody's paying attention and you shouldn't expect them to.
Well, thank you all. I think that's all really interesting perspective. Beth, we'll start with a little history and kind of the legal and statutory authority here. So as an attorney, what does New York law actually require the governor to do when it comes to the state of the state and the budget? And what doesn't it certainly require her to do? And, where does the law stop and does discretion really begin?
Yeah, so I have to plug Ben Liebman's explainer again, because this is one of those things that I think is pretty critical. So these are constitutional provisions that require the governor to give a message to the legislature, but it doesn't have any specifics about when. The legislature is required to convene on the first Wednesday after the first Monday of the new year, which is governed by a completely separate constitutional provision in Article 13 that talks about the political calendar. So legislature has to convene on that day, and it became this tradition, starting with Al Smith, that he wanted to come and give the speech, and that was the day you knew they'd be there. So he gave the speech then. And that continued, for decades. The first time, again, not having gone through each and every year, but the year that Mario Cuomo passed away, he passed away on January 1st. And it was a year when first Wednesday happened to fall, the third, right? The very earliest it could be. So it was a scenario where the governor was going to have to give a state of the state address at a time when, I think for any human being, it was sort of incomprehensible that you'd turn around and give any sort of speech. So he asked the leaders at the time, it was Dean Skelos and Shelley Silver, could he give the speech another day? And, again, went to the books and sort of said, is there any requirement that he has to do this speech that day? And there isn't. So it had just sort of been this tradition. The executive budget does have a date certain. So, there's no requirement that there be an address. That's another thing that's sort of become this tradition that you get up and you tell everybody about your priorities and your objectives in the budget. But really all that's required is that you deliver these bills to the legislature. You have until February 1st in a year that was your election year. So they give you a little more time in that case. Or it's the second Tuesday after, the first Monday of the year. So, usually that Martin Luther King Day, although that has been earlier in some years too. I remember one year I was having a baby actually, and so I did the budget very, very pregnant. I do not recommend that if you can avoid it. But it was actually delivered, I want to say 2 weeks early because the way that Passover and Easter fell that year in 2012, it was, we were going to be out of pocket, as it were, on March 31st. So you can give the budget address earlier. You can give the speech later. You could, be like governors of many years past and do no prepared speech and just send in a book. But actually, when the governor gives the speech, there are these hardbound copies of it that are actually given to the clerk in the assembly and the secretary in the Senate to put on file that satisfies that requirement.
Great. Well, thank you. And you'll probably hear the name Alfred E. Smith quite a bit tonight. Bob sent an article around to a few of us this morning about that. Pretty consequential governor in New York history, and not just because there's a building that some of you have probably worked in downtown called the Alfred E. Smith Building, even though that also has his name on it. Governor back in the 1920s, really responsible in a lot of ways for pushing through those constitutional amendments. And I think it was 1927 that really put us in this position now where we have this very executive heavy budget, which wasn't the case before then. Bob, did you want to go into any more detail on Alfred E. Smith in that capacity?
Oh, just very quickly. Yeah, Al Smith had worked on budget reform. He was a Speaker of the Assembly before he became governor. Had worked on budget reform and passed a whole slew of. So the modern budget process you see in the modern structure of the executive department is all because of Al Smith in the 20s, and the best bill drafter in Albany, Robert Moses, who did way more than build highways and power plants. He was Al Smith's sort of legislative brain. So it's Al Smith for that, and it was FDR who did the first executive budget under that system, coming up on 100 years in 3 years. So if you're ever on a quiz show and there's a question about New York State government, you don't know what the answer is, just say Al Smith, because there's like a 70% chance you'll be right.
And thank you. And Beth alluded to this a little while ago, but while the state of the state was, possible in terms of an address for about 100 years before Al Smith ever gave one orally, it had been delivered, just in message form, right, written form for a century before that. So quite a big impact in his 4 terms as governor, though back then the terms were 2 years instead of 4. So he wasn't even in there for that long to have had quite this impact. So thank you for that, Bob. Carrie, I'm going to flip to you next. How much of the process from your perspective was really driven by statute and law, the way Beth alluded to it, or how much of it did it seem more like driven by tradition, precedent, or, internal executive branch norms?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would say when I was at the agency, I probably had before I came to the governor's office, I had really no concept of what was required by law or constitution, right? I knew that, the people who oversaw us from the governor's office were telling us we had to give them ideas for the state of the state, and then we would give them, and then we wouldn't hear anything for months until, 2 days before the state of the state, when we would get a lot of questions and have to answer a lot of questions, and it would ruin our lives. But when I came to the governor's office, I understood a little bit more about sort of, right, the significance, right, legally and from the constitutional perspective of what we were doing, right, and why we were doing it, and became, I think, just more aware of the strategy around the state of the state. But I think that's where you sort of start veering into, how each governor, differs and how they use this as a tool, right, and what becomes sort of tradition, what becomes sort of like, almost like, pomp and circumstance, right? Like just very like a production, right? And I think you've seen that differently from different governors, but it can become, very built up in terms of the way that it's pulled off. So I think, obviously there's an awareness that we have to, remain within, the confines of the law. But I think beyond that, right, if you're doing it on the dates and within the timeframes, it becomes more about, right, the, excitement of it, and then, the norm of the chamber at that time, and, sort of what we're trying to use these, what are we trying to use these tools to do? Like, what are they the vehicles for?
Thank you. And the next question I have lined up, Bob already answered this, so you're welcome to answer it again. But in the grand scheme of things, on what some folks refer to as Planet Albany, how important are the state of the state and/or the executive budget in the grand scheme of things? So, Bob, I'll kick it to you if you have any additional thoughts from what you said earlier.
Oh yeah, I've always got additional thoughts. Look, the state of the state has created an importance. The speech has now become, Kerry, you said sort of a production, right? It is a chance for the governor to deliver a message to members of the legislature and to the rest of the 500 people who really matter in this town, who make decisions, and then through other avenues to the public, right? But the speech, it is an awful speech as far as a speech goes. It's tens of thousands of words. It's 50 minutes or an hour. A speech that's an hour long is by definition a bad speech. Because, you want to read a good speech, read Lincoln's Second Inaugural, 700 words, 3/4 of them are one syllable. That's a speech for me. But it can be used to set a tone. It can be used to sort of governors always try to establish a tone with the legislature. And what you do is the way you read Moby Dick, which is you read the beginning, skip all the middle and go back to the end. You read the beginning because that kind of sets the tone. Then there's all the stuff in all these subject matter areas. And then you go to the end, which is the big finish, right? Every speechwriter's got to now sit with the state and say, I want the big finish. Give me some soaring rhetoric, right? There has been a soaring rhetoric governor in this town for decades. But it sets a tone. It establishes sort of an environment. And then as soon as the speech's done, it goes out the vent. And then it's back to, F-troop back to normal in Albany. Business just sort of, as usual, on the usual tracks it's been running on for decades.
Well, especially this year, it was wait and see, right? Because you had the speech, that Tuesday, the 13th, and then it was, well, she mentioned this, but we're going to have to wait a week to see the budget bill. So it has become this sort of trickle out, you hear the words, you sort of have in your mind some idea of what that will look like, but until you see the budget language, you don't really know.
It's just talk.
Yeah.
The speech is just talk. The state of the state address is just talk. The budget is where all the real details are. And even then, you have to be kind of a magician to suss them out, because the way it's presented is not a way for normal people to understand what's going on. Right. So it's all sort of, these foggy flashlights in the smoke of Albany, trying to figure out what's actually going on. My cynicism is way up. What can I tell you?
I will say though, just from, the perspective of, right, we have these sort of 2 weeks, right? We have this period of time where the executive gets to say what is important to the executive and what the governor is planning to do, right, for the citizens of New York in this next year. And there's, right, a lot of press coverage happens around the state of the state and the budget, and it's all the good stuff, right? Because it's aspirational, it's the goals, it's we're going to do this, and it's not very detailed, right? So you don't even get to ask a lot of questions, right? Because there's not a lot of finger holds to get into to ask those questions. So I just think from the optics perspective, right, it's like this prime time for the governor to say, this is how I'm serving New Yorkers, right? You get a lot of press coverage, people who wouldn't normally pay attention to what the governor is doing for them. I was at an appointment this morning and the person asked me, what do I do for a living? I said, I work in government, and didn't even say, that I work for the governor. And she said, well, who's the governor? Right. That's most people. Right. But you just read like in the TU, right. Just going back to this past state of the state, Governor Hochul is making universal childcare available in New York State. Right. You don't need to know the details of that. You're a parent in New York State. You see that, like, you're pumped. Right. And then like maybe 6 months down the road, you're like, whatever happened to that universal childcare proposal? You don't know the details. You don't know that there's going to be pilots and it's going to take us 5 years or whatever that proposal is. I'm not saying that that's what the proposal is, by the way. But it's just like, it's a really great opportunity for the governor to take to show what they're doing for New Yorkers better than you have at any other point during the rest of the year and before anybody has poked any holes in what the governor is saying, right? And those holes get poked and people have stopped paying attention by that. So.
And this is all helpful. So, I mean, process-wise, we talk about how these two events happen on an average year, maybe a week, week and a half apart, right? When does the planning actually start? And you alluded to this, Carrie, a little bit. When you're working in the governor's office, you have a different kind of timeline where you think things matter and are relevant than maybe folks in other parts of government. But I'll start with you, Bob. When you were working on both of these, when were you really starting to think through thoroughly what you were going to write and do?
Well, first I want to say is that Kerry's not wrong when she says she sits in the agency, doesn't hear anything until 2 days before, and then it's like, I need all this stuff. So there's a lot of wait and hurry up, or hurry up and wait. The budget making itself starts several months, starts mid into the year before, almost as soon as the budget's done. But it gets sort of in earnest in the fall where the budget analysts come from the first floor up to the second floor, the big piles of stuff. Maybe now it's all on a screen. I don't know. I'm a dinosaur. And start working through major topic areas with the governor. The state of the state in Mario's times was like a year-long production, I think, with his state ops staff and people, because Mario wanted to have a million things to say about a million things. So it was a huge production, and they did a book, a little novelette, 150, 200 pages long, all with little sections. When we got in, our general rule was, well, if Cuomo did it, we're not doing it. Cuomo did a big book. We didn't do a big book because we had just gotten there. And so we did a speech that was 24 pages long, probably took 26 minutes to read. And that's all George Pataki. He never did a book. He just did a speech, because some might say the speech was the only thing that was necessary. Some might say we were making it up on the fly. Probably a little bit of both. And the state of the state, depending upon the speech, depending on what the governor wants, can take an enormous amount of time. And is usually, in my experience, the governor and the speechwriter, and then everybody filters in through the speechwriter, right? Which gives the speechwriter a tremendous amount of power, because you can just say, oh, I forgot to put that in the speech, and the governor never asked, so it's not in the speech because I didn't like it. And the budget speech is a shorter process because it's less of a big speech.
Does that differ from your experience, Beth?
Yeah, I'm smiling a little bit only because, the governor that I worked for, we would actually have to do the big production. It was, I need a million things about a million things. So, it would start in August, really, with the agencies trying to figure out, okay, what are the things that we need to do? What are the big ideas? What are the cleanup ideas? What are just like good government ideas? So you'd get a list of 100 from an agency, and someone like Carrie would be going through and saying, half of these we can't do. So Governor Cuomo also kept to a 2% state spending cap. So right away you'd have 60% of the ideas, this costs too much money, can't do it, right? So you'd have this constant winnowing of different ideas. And, I got to see it from sort of a very high level vantage point. So when we got to, here's the speech, both years, there were things that were in the speech where we would all turn and look at each other and say, what is that talking about? What initiative is that? And is that on your plate? Were you coming up with it? So, we had scrambles, where we were calling the agency probably, maybe not 2 days before, but maybe a week before, saying, apparently we're rolling this out in the speech. So what do you have? Give me your ideas.
Did you find that idea often came in the governor's handwriting in a margin on the draft?
Sometimes it did.
Sort of a gubernatorial blurt.
Sometimes it did, but sometimes you could actually see that this was someone who had been hawking an idea around the periphery for a long time and somehow got it into the speech. And then if he liked it, it was it.
Carrie, I'm curious for your thoughts as well, but before I ask you to do that, in my experience, one of the biggest headaches was what we were always coining like version control, where there was all these versions of the speech floating around the second floor, and you got your hands on one and you edited it, and then you'd see another one an hour later, and you're like, I could have sworn I changed that. And then you get another one an hour later, and it's back in, and you're not quite sure how it got there. So, Bob, I think what you'd said makes sense on some level. But Carrie, in working for Governor Andrew Cuomo and then for Governor Hochul, how have you seen the processes look different between the two of them, if at all? Maybe it's looked quite a bit similar.
Yeah, I mean, and I have different perspectives too, right? From the agency, we were always very excited about this time of year. I mean, I was, I think like lots of people, who are, I guess dorky in this way, get excited about it no matter where, matter where you're working or what you're doing. But from the agency, we would always see this as opportunities, right? To pitch chamber on what we thought were like the big ideas, right? Like this is reform, this can revolutionize our system. This is a really big deal. This is what other states are doing. We should be doing this here. A lot of times they had big price tags, sometimes not, right? Very rarely not. Most of the time they have big price tags. I think generally speaking, when you want to do good stuff in government, it costs a lot of money. So from the agency, we would get really excited and we would start this process early and like really be like shining our presentations, right? So with this like, Shark Tank kind of mentality, right? Like we're going to get in there, we're going to pitch. I think from the chamber perspective, the same thing when I was assistant secretary in DepSec, like just really excited to get these proposals, to work with the agencies on them, to try to refine them. But then also, I think with like a slightly more strategic hat of like, well, we're never going to do this, right? Like politically, this is untenable. Financially, we can't afford this, right? This is going to piss off more people than it's going to please, right? It doesn't fall into, oftentimes, I think Governor Hochul is a good example of this. She will have, she sort of sets forward what her priorities are, and you try really to kind of like pigeonhole your ideas into those priorities. Like, affordability can be a really broad bucket, right? Like how can I make whatever, about affordability? And I'm a little bit lost on what the question was now.
You're on
But
track.
so I think it looks very, sort of similar, amongst the two different governors. But I think, depending sort of where you're sitting in the process of, being a part of the, the sausage making factory, right? Like it looks a little bit different. I had the opportunity to come back while I was, technically not working full time, but, come back in a part-time capacity to help the governor and her team on State of the State last year. And that was very different, to be part of the policy team, sort of pitching the governor on these ideas, and seeing, the sort of what was behind the scenes to me and every other position was like that process, right? Of the pitching and the talking about it and the, helping your principal to understand. And then, the real difficulty in saying that this is a really good idea, but we can't do it, right? For X, Y, and Z. And, so that was just a completely different process altogether. So yeah, it's a fantastic, I think opportunity to sort of like a social experiment, right? Or, a study on this process. And depending on what position you're in or what you're doing in the process, your perspective is a little bit different, but I think what I think is like the real takeaway for me is that starting at the agency level and at every step of the process as you're reviewing and going through, although you don't necessarily always feel it at every process, it really is a very thoughtful, right? And process where you're really looking at like what can we do? Oftentimes it's political. You're trying to check the political boxes that you need to check, right? I think, Beth hit the nail, right? You have to have the right number of proposals to make sure that all the constituency groups are happy, that no one can complain too much. This constituency group's got to have like, 10 proposals that work for them, and there's a lot of that too, right? But I think it is really thoughtful and really intentional. And the product is something that I think everybody is, feels really proud of at the end. It doesn't always roll out right the way that we intend it to, but I think it's a well-intentioned product.
In my role as kind of informal translator here, just for students.
Sorry.
No, I told you we'd clean it up. DepSec, Deputy Secretary, Chamber. You might hear the Executive Chamber, or Chamber for short. Not the second floor, but the second floor of the Capitol building is the governor's office. So Carrie was also on the second floor earlier before she came in here. Wasn't sure where we were on the second floor. The one in the Capitol is definitely more confusing. And then agency, state agencies is what that's definitely referencing. So there's give or take 100 state agencies now. So just to kind of interpret that, when you're at a state agency, especially if you're in like kind of a, legal or policy making role, you're asked by the governor's office to kind of submit a list of proposals. Sometimes it's the day before the speech, or it's like, hey, the governor looked at everything that you guys came up with and she wants something different. Or to Bob's point earlier, you submit them in August and you hear about them in late December when you're sitting down for dinner on Christmas. But just to kind of, yeah, there's definitely a lot of that. A question that I hadn't really prepared, but I'm just thinking through as all three of you were talking is, presumably you've all been in the room with respective governors during these discussions, and I'm sure that it runs the gamut, and you probably can't share some of what you've heard in those settings, but what is the tenor like? What type of questions are the respective governors that you've worked for asking when it comes to kind of state of the state or budget related proposals? Like what's the kind of mood in the room as those things played out? Bob, I'll kick it to you first.
Obviously I can't speak to either of the Cuomos or Spitzer or Patterson or Governor Hochul, but Governor Pataki was, I mean, he worked hard, but he was very mellow and easy to deal with on this stuff. You know, he leaned back, put his feet on the desk, and then he'd sit there and you'd explain something you've been working on for 3 weeks, and in 4 seconds he would figure out what the hole was in it. Really, really sharp mind and easy about it. So he could flip through all the files. He was like an AI machine. He could flip through all the files and figure out, like, this is the nub. This is what the issue is governmentally. This is what the issue is fiscally. This is what the issue is operationally. And this is what the issue is politically. And one of the things we haven't really talked about is the influence of politics in all this stuff, right? So we'd be sitting there, say, in an election year, hypothetically, and we're doing the budget or we're doing the budget speech or the state of the state. And the governor's like, look, I know in October, I need to be talking about this. So what are you doing now in December, in January, to make it possible for me to be talking about this in October? Because I know this is going to be an election issue, right? And Kerry, you mentioned like box checking. That's what the box checking is about, right? Interest group politics. How do I manage all these special groups within this governmental process? And then, you know, when you see budgets now, it's like, well, what does this mean for the teachers unions? And what does it mean for 1199? 1199 is the major hospital workers union in the state. They take turns running government along with the teachers union.
Actually, I think they've both been in the driver's seat for a while.
Maybe it's like a driver's
Yeah.
ed car, you know, with 2
Yes.
steering wheels and 2 sets of
Because
brakes.
The brakes.
Neither of them have the brakes. Let me tell you, they just got gas. So that's what it was like. It was kind of relaxed, but it was tense, and you knew you didn't want to. Nice thing about Governor Pataki was, if you didn't have the answer to his question, he didn't think less of you. You thought more of him, because it's like, oh, he got what I couldn't answer. He's a smart guy, because I think I thought about everything, and that was the beauty about working for him. He was mellowest governor ever, except maybe for David Patterson, who was mellow for other reasons.
Beth?
Well, I won't say my experience was mellow, but
You worked for Andrew. There's nothing. He can't spell the word.
it was not mellow. But I will say, you know, it was a hot bench, right? It was, you were going in, you had to be fully prepared. And, you know, like similar to what you're saying with Governor Pataki, it was very easy to think that you had everything prepared, only to suddenly have him zero in on exactly the weak spot of your argument. Like the one thing that was not fully fleshed out, that you were still, you know, trying to work with the agency on or trying to figure it out, he would drill down on it immediately. He had an X-ray vision for, you know, what's the plot hole here, right? And so I will say, you know, I think that might just be a commonality amongst New York executives, that like they know better than you do their own politics, and it's their name on that speech at the end of the day. As much of your blood, sweat, and tears are going into it, it's about them, and they are, you know, really laser focused on getting every single detail of that right.
Jerry?
I mean, I think like, you know, whenever you're in the room with the governor of the state of New York, right, that time is precious. And you don't want to do a bad job, right? You want to be representing, you know, the things that you believe in, whether it's because it's your policy niche or it's you've worked on it or whatever, right? Because you're talking to the governor, just period. You know what, you want to be prepared. You want to have all the details. You want to have done as much as you can do to poke holes, right? Because you don't want to waste the governor's time. I have found, I didn't actually have the pleasure of pitching Governor Cuomo on anything, but, you know, heard, you know, got the feedback from my bosses. But I found my, in conversations with Governor Hochul around, the different ideas from the agencies, like really thoughtful conversations, right? And again, like asking those questions that you would just never think to ask. Because yeah, you're looking at it from one perspective and the governor's looking at it from a very different perspective. But I think it's always, yeah, you want to use that time, you don't get a lot of it. And you want to go in there really ready, to convey. And a lot of times it can be really difficult because these are complicated, pieces of policy, complicated, it's policy and operations and law all coming together that can be very complicated to explain in a few minutes. And then to be able to answer the follow-up questions again, without getting super weedy, because you just don't have time and patience and tolerance to do that. So I think to me, that's always the trick when, briefing principals and particularly the governors, like how to make this understandable and concise without having to give all the details, because it can be really tough when we're talking about really complicated stuff.
And a lot of times, Carrie, it depends on the character and the personality of the executive, right? I can think of one night, the night before we're about to launch a major piece of legislation. We're in the governor's office. Actually, we're in the secretary of the governor's office, his chief of staff. And there's like 12 of us in the room. And we're all talking about this one piece of this bill. And the governor's like, I want to take it out. And the rest of us are like, no, you can't take it out. You can't take it out. You can't take it out because of the politics. You can't take it out because of this. And the governor's like, I'm only the governor. I'm just the governor. But if you guys think so, then fine, right? And when it goes wrong, we'll know who blew it, right? But it was his way of trusting his staff and saying, well, okay, like I know a lot of things, I know almost everything, but I'm going to trust my people and their judgment because they're only thinking out for me. So, but that's a lot of that is, and that takes a lot of the pressure out of the room.
It's a real mental exercise when you're kind of going into a room saying, I'm, in theory, the expert, or at least the person in the building who knows the most about a subject matter. And then you're faced with someone whose problems are much greater than yours, trying to both give them the specifics that they need, but also not get so lost in it that they're like, wait, why are you telling me the other stuff? Should we do it or should we not do it? So it's a really delicate balance. It sounds like we can all relate to having had that experience. Bob, I wanted to go back to you quickly on the actual writing process, because I think of the four of us, you've had probably combined by far the most experience actually writing state speeches, executive budget speeches. What was that process like? How do you get the executive's voice? And I'm sure over time it's easier, but how do you really make sure that you're getting that right? How big of a critic was your boss in looking at the speeches?
The main thing is, well, you just said it, Pat. You want to make the governor sound like the governor. Now, sometimes the governor wants to sound like Olivier, right? Which doesn't always happen. So some of it's like trying to be truthful with the principal, right? Pataki, here's news for you guys who haven't, was not a great speech maker, right? He kind of spoke out of the corner of his mouth. He licked his lips a lot. He was not like, he wasn't Lincoln, so that is one, is understanding the governor's voice. Two is understanding what the governor needs to be talking about at this point in time and for down the road, right? Because the speech is not just about today. This is about, if it's the state of the state and you're laying out your program and the agenda, it is the program and the agenda for the year, for the most part, 80% of it. Things will always come up later on. If it's the budget speech, you are trying to put help people understand. I wrote budget speeches. My goal is to have no numbers in, except for the page numbers. I just wanted to tell stories about how the state budget affected real people. And that's what I wanted to talk about. So my goal was always budget speech, no numbers, which was, I lost most of the time. But if you make it about the budget, right, no one's going to want to hear that. So it's storytelling, it's working with the governor to capture his voice, and then it's fielding all the people who are trying to get into this thing, right? There's like, everybody wants to get into this pool, right? And there's only got room for so many. So it's like, it's like a clown car, right? It can only fit so many people, and everyone's trying to get in there somehow. And it's fielding that. And then it's the process of putting the words together, which is, the state of the state's tens of thousands of words. Nobody ever wrote that many at once. So it's doing it in sections. It's figuring out the formula. It's figuring out flow. It's writing. It's having transition statements that are more than, and furthermore is not a transition statement. For those of you who are writing brief, well, maybe you're working a legal brief because that's where writing goes to die. But it's long and it's torturous. And the night before the state of the state, I don't know what your experience was. This was it with Pataki. We'd all get together in the assembly chamber. Back then, it was, pre-hyper production like now. It was in this assembly chamber, and everybody would come out of the woodwork and try to get into the rehearsal and try to put in their 2 cents and try to argue a point of law and try to say, well, shouldn't it be that instead of which? It's like, you're not allowed, right? You're not allowed, like, you're here to listen if you got something. So it is really hard, right? It is an ordeal. And the frustrating thing for me about the state of the state was, like I said, the minute it's out, it's like smoke out the vent. Poof, it's gone. All this work for a speech that nobody cares about 2 days later because they're waiting for the budget.
Waiting for the budget.
So for me, if I were an efficiency expert, I'd say scrap the whole thing. Do 15 minutes. Here's my agenda. Here's the book. I got to go.
I want to touch on a point that you made there, specific to what kind of the external stakeholders and influences can be. I think you referred to some powerful unions, certainly whether it's, clergy groups, hospital systems, significant legislative leaders, especially in the part of the state that the person you're working for might be from. There's all sorts of kind of special and unique interests outside of the actual people on the second floor that are trying to make their way into both the state of the state and the budget. So Beth, I'll start with you. Like, what was that experience like, kind of getting, and I guess maybe specifically for you, what's it like being on the other side of that, maybe a little bit now, representing some of those interests? So I'll start with the latter or the former, whichever you prefer.
Well, so in government, it's always easy to sort of keep your eye on the ball, right? Of what is the overarching mission that we have. And you always sort of, keep this in the back of your mind, right? This is, if the theme is affordability, right? You're looking at everything through this lens of, is this helping or hurting? And how are we keeping all of that consistent? But I will say it was, it's box checking, it's balancing, it's, if we're doing this over here, if we've got this for Western New York, what do we have for Long Island? It's geographic balance. It's the legislative leaders, but it's, the city of New York and significant, new electeds, right? I want to help Sharon Owens in Syracuse. What can I announce, for her that is going to, help me then run with her in Central New York in 8 months. So, all of those different political deliverables. And I think, it's hyper focused in an election year, right? We're talking about an election year, not only for the governor, but the legislature, which runs every 2 years. So every one of those members is up for election. So you're looking at all of those things and trying to balance it. But so people could come in and they could pitch us on, 5,000 ideas. And we'd shoehorn them into some version of what we wanted it to be. That's the thing that people sort of forget is, they're holding the pencil. So, they're asking for $100 million and it becomes, a competitive process for $25 million that, is going to actually get delivered in 18 months. You're going to declare victory from that. And they would. So, again, it's a symbiotic relationship where you have all the cards. So if you're saying, yes, this is what we're doing on it, they're going to find a way to live within that box and be happy. It feels harder when you no longer have that pencil and you're going and saying, but look, I know this checks all of your boxes. Do the $100 million plan and just allocate it now. It's so easy. That would be the perfect thing for you to do. But at the end of the day, I think we all do spend a lot of time, trying to figure out how one, we craft something that we think is achievable. And then again, how we take whatever it is that's ultimately done and make that work for us. That's, it's the same creative force, just, we're applying it on different ends of that.
How about you, Carrie?
I mean, I think it's really critical to hear from, people external to government, right? How the work that we do in government feels to them, right? And I think I'm always really grateful that I started my work outside of government but in a field that was heavily regulated by government, right? Because I know what that felt like, and I knew where there were pain points that, I couldn't do what I needed to do, and it was because of state law, right? And, I had a different understanding of, why there was that law, right? And as as my perspectives changed, I had a different understanding, right? But I always was very grateful for that previous perspective, right? And the same thing when I went from an agency to chamber and then back to an agency and then back to chamber, right? It's all, food for the understanding of why things are the way that they are. And just that same way, right? It's really important to hear from external groups who are experiencing what we're doing. And oftentimes government is very well-intentioned in what it's doing, right? We pass a set of regulations, we fund this thing over here, and then we hear later, like, oh, but the downstream impact of that reg package, or when you didn't give us this extra 10 million, right? This is what was the consequence. This is what we had to cut because of that, right? And so it's very helpful to hear that. And you can't, unfortunately, right, in a resource constrained environment, and even in New York with a 260 something billion dollar budget, right? That is still, it's, that's it, right? There's still, $700 billion worth of ideas, right, that didn't make it in. That are good ideas or could do good things, right? So, it's just balancing, I think, what we can do, what we need to do, what we wish we could do in a perfect world, and then what's the return, right? Because sometimes, an idea is great, but you're not gonna do anything for 10 years, right? And we have more important things that need to get done right now, right? And it's just, it's a balancing act.
Thank you all. Bob, did you want to add anything to that?
I want, as you're talking, Carrie, I'm thinking, the tension between, the agencies that are doing one thing all day, or say focusing on one particular area all day, and the governor's office, which is responsible for a million things, including the politics, which is not the, right, not the law, the government agencies, not the agency's responsibility to think about the governor's politics. One, they're not qualified to. Two, they don't understand the governor's politics like the governor's people do. And three, like, they'll only make it worse, right? So you would come, and I know this, from your work in OPWDD, like massive issues, massive things that could be done with state funding and state attention for the way nonprofits serve people with developmental disabilities. I haven't worked in this field as long as you have, but I've worked it for like 10 years with clients. But it's like, how do I get this on the governor's plate when the 200-pound gorillas, right? I have one little piece of data. In Governor Hochul's first 4 budgets, Medicaid, which is money for hospitals, accounted for 61% of the $29 billion increase. So that means Medicaid itself, hospitals and hospital unions have gotten more of the increase than all the other programs in state government combined, right? Healthcare, education has accounted for 28%. So now you got 89, 90% of the growth in government spending over the last 4 years going to 2 areas. How on earth is the IDD sector going to fight with that? When it is crucial direct human services. And that's a part of the process where the substance and the good that can be done gets lost in the power politics in Albany. And that is the most deeply disappointing part of this process. Because there's plenty of money to do what people need to do for people who need help, right? Tons of money. That made me a fiscal conservative. I don't have to cut. There's plenty of money to do stuff, right? You just got to reallocate it to places where the need is greatest as opposed to the political benefit is greatest. So the budget, if anything, is a roadmap to who has favored nation status in New York State politics.
Well, I would think, though, because we also came from this, from an executive perspective, but I started my career in the legislature, and it is extremely easy for a legislator to say, what do my constituents care about the most? What am I hearing from people every day about? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say it's, healthcare, either, because of access issues or because there are, they are usually the largest employer in an area. And it's school aid and schools and property taxes. And that is a flat circle basically of all of the issues sort of leading back to what do I need to deliver as a local assembly or senator?
Right.
It's increased school aid and, increased funding for this hospital or new emergency room or cancer center. And, I do, I participate in the joke because it's always, we can point the finger at the unions, but this is good retail politics for the entirety of the legislature too.
That's the word. We can have this debate offline, but you tell me if schools and healthcare are better now than they were 4 years ago. If healthcare is any cheaper now than it was 4 years ago. It's
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
And if schools are better. I mean, reading levels are the lowest they've been in 20 years. So,
Yeah, but
like,
we've also, as part of this, we've also
Sorry, I
constrained
did.
healthcare spending below where it's grown, I think, in other areas. So
that
when
one,
we-
now
when
you,
we-
now you lost me. All I know is I can't get to see my doctor for 3 months.
when we had the global cap, right, we were holding healthcare spending below the level that it wanted to grow at. And I think that's the challenge is in New York, we have a population and we have citizens that demand a lot for, what their tax dollars are paying for. So, I mean, I see that push pull.
We apologize to the humans in the audience.
Well, and we have very generous programs in New York, right? Which, account for a lot of that continued increase. And I think, this is a perfect example, right? This conversation that's happening here, right? Because all the issues that come before the executive, right, are all sympathetic and necessary, right? You can't make a case for not funding bridges and roads and affordable housing development so that you can continue to fund Medicaid programs, which, by the way, OPWDD services are funded by Medicaid. So every Medicaid increase benefits, people with disabilities too, just to be clear. But, you have to weigh, right? And you have to be able to make those investments incrementally, which I think, you've seen happening, right? Making incremental investments across the board, where they can be most meaningful while also knowing that you can't do every single thing for every single person in every single budget. And that's the tension, right? That happens through the state of the state development, through the executive budget development. And then to Beth's point, right? We're not really talking about the role that the legislature plays. And although we've focused on, the outsized authority that the executive has, the legislature does have a role, right? They have an important role and these conversations do happen. And what, bubbles up to be priorities for the leaders, right? Those are the conversations that the governor and the leaders of the houses are having about what makes a balanced, final enacted budget, right? That everybody feels like they're achieving what they need to achieve on behalf of constituents, right?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably discuss this point for probably a 2-hour program because I don't think anyone's wrong, but I mean, it's tough because you see like a 260 billion-dollar budget, but there's still all these things that we're not funding with it, right? And it's a lot, and there's a lot of challenging conversations you end up having with different types of stakeholders. Some of them who've been at it for a while probably know what the likelihood is of them kind of scoring the big investment, but it's a lot to balance. And the politics of the time and the public affairs of the time indicate where directions go on certain things as well. Since we are at a law school and I'm mindful of time, I did want to ask one question to Beth specifically along the lines of that. And I'm thinking of this especially for students. No one has said this term yet today, but you hear a lot of terms, people talking about like things called Article 7s. So Article 7 is the part of the state constitution that governs the budget process. But could you speak a little bit to like what that looks like as the governor's chief counsel when you're in that role, what the review of those look like? And
Yeah.
I'll start there, and then I might have a follow-up question.
Yeah, so, every year, the governor has to submit appropriation bills. Currently, although Governor Pataki did it differently, there's a capital, an aid to localities, a state operations bill, as well as debt service and a Ledge and Judy budget bill. legislature.
Sure, he's saying.
Yes, yes. So you have the appropriations and then you have coordinating what we call Article 7s, but it's really just legislative proposals that go along with those items of appropriation. Sometimes there are things in an Article 7 that are completely unrelated to any particular appropriation. But really what's required is that there be some sort of fiscal nexus. I read all of them when I was counsel. It was like a 3 or 4 day process of, just sort of making sure the legislation was doing what it was intended to do. Sometimes you would, get a bill and you'd know that the announcement in the speech was, for instance, we are going to do, a pilot upstate, and this would be, this is a pilot in one location in a city with 1 million or more, individuals. So you'd say, this is not right, doesn't match the speech, send it back for revisions. But a lot of times the bills themselves are drafted by the agencies in coordination with Division of Budget. They would, load them up into a portal so that they were electronic. We could read them electronically. And, you just sort of rip through them to make sure that it was really tracking what it needed to do.
Okay, great. And just one final question for you. There's over the years, we talked about how this kind of version of this executive-driven budget process has been around since the 1920s. So do you mind just briefly touching on like one or two of like kind of the bigger pieces of legislation that have kind of challenged that, or at least come up in that? I'm thinking largely some of the cases regarding actually the administration that Bob worked for back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, so I mean, there is one big case that sort of dominates how how we negotiate the executive budget now. And that was Silver versus Pataki, which was actually 2 cases that got consolidated before the Court of Appeals. But essentially, it reinforced the notion that the executive is the constructor of the budget. The executive gets to set forth the amount and purposes of the appropriations, and the legislature is really stuck. They can strike out an item of appropriation or reduce it. If they want to create a new appropriation, they have to separately state it. That's so that the governor can go in and line item veto it. And none of those appropriations can be what are called substitutions. They cannot alter what the governor has put forward as an item of appropriation. So a lot of that consternation is, tension between the houses and the governor is around whether or not something could be a substitution. And so say the governor puts forward his plan for school aid is going to be, or her plan for school aid is going to be focused on the big 5 city school districts, right? They're going to get an outsized amount of aid this year. If the legislature comes in and they say, we want to fund rural districts, they would not be able to strike out and replace their own school aid formula. That's something that is always every budget hotly debated, hotly negotiated. And ultimately what happens is in an enacted budget, the governor resubmits the 3-way agreed upon version of that because the legislature, if they wanted to, could not alter that appropriation and then pass it. It would be an unconstitutional substitution.
Thank you for explaining
Yeah,
that. Please.
I'm no lawyer, but the legislature could vote down the governor's bills and then pass their own bills. The cleaner process would, right, the old phrase used to be, the governor proposes and the legislature disposes. So if you didn't have all this mishigas with leaders meetings and stuff, then you could have the governor sends his or her budget up. Legislature does its thing. Governor goes to Cancun for a month, right? Or a Bills game, or well, no more Bills games. Sorry. And the legislature does its thing, within the parameters of the Constitution and precedent, and then sends it back to the governor, and the governor does his or her thing within the parameters of the Constitution as interpreted by the Court of Appeals, right? That would be the cleanest thing. That way you wouldn't, it would remove the fog. It would move a lot of the fog. It would move a lot of the mystery. It would put a lot of people out of work. In the public affairs business, I think, right? But that would be the cleaner thing, and it would take forever.
You know, we definitely did have debates when I worked in the legislature about just, let's vote them down. If we vote them down, then we can come up with whatever it is we want to come up with. That's actually, at the time that I worked for the legislature, it was a Republican Senate and a Democratic Assembly. It's much easier said than done to even come to agreement in those two parties. And I was joking with someone on the way in, when Elliot Spitzer came into office, one of his major initiatives was budget reform. And there was going to be this, sea change in how we were going to negotiate budgets. And it was not going to be three men in a room, and there was going to be sunlight in the process, and we would have conference committees, and, largely that's gone by the wayside. But, I do credit that budget reform and Silver v. Pataki with a string of almost on-time budgets, right? Some of them were a day or two late, but 2005 to 2009, you had on-time budgets largely because the legislature said there are so many restrictions on what we can do right now.
Mhm.
We have no choice but to compromise.
Yeah.
And I think where in your version, it would be the legislature doesn't compromise and votes down those budget bills and then tries to compromise solely between themselves. You almost need that third party, I think, in the room to sort of ensure that there's a balance to any compromise, that you can get to that three-way enacted budget.
Well, and the current system gives everybody a lot of cover,
Yeah, that's true too.
which is the political piece of it. So,
Thank you both. Before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to also acknowledge Justice Bud Malone here, who authored the trial court decision in one of those two cases that led to the case that Beth was talking about, Pataki v. Silver. So thank you for joining us, and I'm sure you know a lot more about this than all of us combined. So thanks for being here. That's it as far. We have 25 more questions, but we're mindful of all of your time. A reminder to students in particular, there is still food to my right, your left. But before we get there, we have about 10, 15 minutes for questions. We have a few that came in on Zoom. So Chell, do you want to start with those? And then if we have any in the room, we can turn to you.
Sure. So we have a couple of folks asking, all have spoken about Planet Albany and how, people who are, enmeshed in Planet Albany know what's going on. But we've talked about sort of the broader public at large, right? Maybe not necessarily caring as much or not having awareness of, the state of the state and the budget process. Bob talks about, maybe we shouldn't expect them to, but are there things about the budget process that any of the speakers wish or would like to see, members of the public aware of and focused on? And where do we start?
Carrie, you want to start? You don't have to. But.
I think, I think as a global question, do I wish more constituents, more people were more civically minded and paying attention? Sure. I think that it's really hard, to do that. I think part of the job of government that is difficult, and maybe this is more of the governor's office, but I think the state agencies too, right? I think generally the job of government is it can be hard to translate to people. These are all the ways that government is doing for you what you need government to do, right? And I mean, I think even myself before coming to work in government, had just sort of like, my mom was a long time, she retired from the Department of Health after working there for 40 years. And I still had sort of this like, misunderstanding, I guess, of what was happening in state government, right? So I do think that state government agencies, and I think the legislature probably does this better because they have to, right? That's part of like how they become members of the legislature. But I think on the, the exec side, always striving to make that connection for people. If you need this, government can provide this for you. If this isn't meeting your needs, right, here are ways for you to, interact with the state agencies who do this. And I think that's how those priorities make their way through, kind of a convoluted or, multi-step process of becoming part of the state agenda or, a budget process. I mean, I think you see things like, talking about making New York, a state that has universal childcare, right? That comes from, hearing from childcare providers that the current system is difficult, that, hearing from families that they don't have access to care when they need it or in the ways that they need it, right? And that, the more families that speak up, the more childcare providers that speak up, the more the agency hears it, the more they craft proposals to meet those needs. And it becomes part of the budget and part of the state and part of the agenda. So if it's anything, I guess I would say that, like, if there's something that's happening or, in a person's life that's not working, right, to communicate that to, elected officials, to state agencies that are responsible for making these programs work, and to, work in coalition with other families or other providers or whatever it is, right, that, that can help to raise those voices and make them heard, because that's how things change.
Thank you. Beth?
I have to say, I'd rather, 80, passionate but committed advocates, are approaching government than, sometimes you see 80,000 people that are sort of captured by a slogan. And that becomes, I think, the hardest thing to sort of fight against when you're, reduced to, tweets or reduced to these, TikTok reels. It really does, there's a great place for those types of explainers that really break things down into really simplistic terms for people, but it also, strips out any nuance and it becomes sort of like you're either doing what I want or you are the enemy. And, those are, I think, the hardest places to be in government.
Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you can put the information out there, but if people aren't, how many quips do I got? About 30 of them on this thing. There's 1,000 to 1 rule, which is people we're trying to talk to are thinking about 1,000 things all the time. And if we're lucky, one of them is the thing we think about all the time. So how do you crack through that? If it is relevant and important to their lives on a daily basis. And that is the trick. And if there's something that you want the public to get activated about, well, you got to get their attention. How do you get their attention? These days, you piss them off, right? Anger is a great motivator, and you make them afraid. And that's the tenor in the country, in both parties across the country. Make people afraid of the other guy, right? That's not education, that's agitation, right? But this is human nature. So we're dealing with human nature, not a bunch of people who are policy wonks and who can recite. I mean, Beth just told you what Article 7 was. You know how many people can do that? Like 9. So, we're dealing in the world. So it's really hard. And that's what gives us the poison political culture we have now. And why nobody cares about government, except the people who are part of the government industrial complex, which is us.
Well, thank you all. Jill, is there another question from online?
Yes, I have a couple.
Okay.
As we look forward in the legislative session and the budget negotiation process, can you talk a little bit about kind of who's in these conversations now going forward as the legislature and the executive chamber navigate that? Who's in the room? And, from your experience or from
Any preference? Beth, you want to go first?
I mean, I think we should recuse Carrie from this
That's
one.
fair. That's fair.
Not
Up to you.
sharing any state secrets, but typically as you sort of go forward, the governor would have, the privilege sort of the office. So the governor would always bring kind of whoever he wanted to a negotiation when you start talking about the budget. So, typically it's the budget director, typically the council, depending on who's in a few other seats. Sometimes it's the secretary to the governor, sometimes it's state operations, but the governor sort of picks his fighters, so to speak. And then, you would have the legislative leader. So Andrea Stewart Cousins, Carl Hasty would typically bring their finance person and their counsel. And so, you'd have anywhere between, I don't know, 8 and 10 people probably sitting in that room, trying to hash out whatever the topic of the day was.
And then one level outside of that leadership is, I mean, all the stuff is like a solar system, right? So what Beth just described was, let's call it the sun, right? And then circulating, rotating around the sun is all the people chirping in those folks' ears, right? So you've got the speaker and the majority leader, whose number one job of the speaker and the majority leader is to stay the speaker and the majority leader, which means maintain or grow their majority. So they identify what are the issues we care about philosophically. They have a thing called marginal members, which are members of the legislature who are on the bubble, right? At risk of losing the next time. So if you're in the majority, who are your marginal members? What do they need to get reelected? What are their threats? Okay, those are going to be our priorities. Because 90% of the budget's going to be fine. We're really tinkering around 10%, right?
School aid and healthcare.
It's school aid and healthcare, and as education and healthcare continue to plummet, let's keep shoving money into. Sorry, commercial message.
Well, and then I just think it's the group that Beth talked about is like, right, that group is coming to some kind of conceptual agreements, right? About, we're going to move in this direction. We're going to, this is the general gist of what we're going to do. And then, layers down staff are kind of like, negotiating out the details, right? And then there's this process, right, where it kind of goes back and forth because maybe what folks thought was the conceptual agreement doesn't actually bear out in the actual writing, right? Because everybody's got their own thoughts and perspectives when they're drafting these things. So it's a round and around and around process. And, I think for a much longer conversation another day would be very interesting to talk about those different levels because it's interesting.
Yeah.
And in that process, right, in the speech making process, I said it's the speech writer, it's the writer who's got the power, right? Because everything goes through that person. But in this process, it's the lawyers, it's you guys, because if you can find me 5 members of the entire legislature who in the last 10 years have read the whole budget before voting on it, I will buy you lunch for a year. There's nobody. It's all in the bills. And it's all in is it supposed to be for Syracuse, but does it say people over 1 million? Oh, drafting error, right? So right, it's the old Nancy Pelosi thing. We got to vote for it before we can know what's in it. None of these people know what's in it other than school aid for my district. We did the packaging bill, the slogan thing that they want, right? Well, counsel's office says I'm good.
Well,
right?
And I will say, there probably is no person who reads the entire budget because I will, fully admit the appropriation bills, not my area, right? So like there's a whole different process for how you finalize those appropriation bills, what the final amount of money is that's going to Department of Health and state operations, what's going to this line item or that line item. That is Senate Finance, Assembly Ways and Means, Division of the Budget. They're working directly with bill drafting, finalizing those bills. So much of this effort goes into the policy around it, but the $260 billion is, all in that silo.
Right, but if you find me a health committee chair who's read the whole healthcare budget, I'll just give me that. But you're not telling me Gustavo Rivera's reading the budget or much.
Another way to take the question, and I'm not sure how it was intended, I'm not sure where the source of it, but at least in my experience, the negotiations start. I mean, there's certain issues that are going to require like the governor and the leader's decision, and you kind of know that from the outset that the people who are on the bottom rung, albeit important rung of negotiations, are just aware from the outset it's too big of a money thing, too big of a policy thing, we're not going to deal with it. But there's 10, 12, 14 different tables, they call them, right, negotiating spaces that involve division of budget staff, the governor's staff, and staff from both of the houses. So just to kind of get a little bit more rudimentary for folks. And if you can hash things out there, you do. If you can't, you kind of quote unquote kick it up and goes up to another set of higher ranking staffers, which is probably kind of the setting that Beth was referring to. And then from there, it can actually be where the governor and the two leaders are themselves in the room for some of this as well. So just to kind of get back to that, there's a lot of people and it kind of shrinks, but it's fluid, right? So you might think you have something ironed out. To Carrie's point, something else kind of blows up. And then it's like, well, we're back to the starting board on this because someone introduced a 10-point policy plan 2 days before you wanted to close the budget out, and now we're starting over. So it's fluid, but the first starting point is negotiations, getting everyone to the table.
And Pat, we all left out one key figure in all of this is the political consultant. The person who's running the campaigns for the Democratic Assembly, for the campaign committees, for the two majorities and for the governor. Because they are weighing, you talk about weighing in on the top line, right? They were like, you can't do that. I know you want to, but that's political suicide. You cannot do that. Or that will hurt you with this group, that group, and the other group. And that's part of the coalition. You'll need to get reelected. So that's the other figure who is never seen going in and out of a leader's
right. Yep.
Who is never seen in the Capitol, but always knows the back stairway.
That's true too. That's a good point.
I mean, I hate to poison this with politics, but it is a small part of the equation.
It definitely does play a role from time to time, for sure. Chell, is there any other questions online? Okay. I'm mindful of time. If folks have to leave, please don't, but we said 7, so we'll be wrapped up quickly here.
What was the most rewarding proposal any of you have worked on in your past roles that was enacted? And how many times did you have to sleep overnight in your office during the budget season?
Is that a 2-part question? Carrie, do you want to start?
Sure. I guess I've had, the privilege really to work on a lot of really meaningful, policy, proposals, and to play a supporting role to the attorneys who are negotiating the laws that, upheld these policies. But my first year in the governor's office, I worked on the raise the age legislation, and that had been kicking around for a very long time. And finally, there was a decision, I think, amongst, the executive and the houses that we were going to get this done. And that was my first year. And I had literally no idea what I was walking into in terms of like what negotiations looked like, what my role was. There's not like that nobody like gives you like a primer on like what your job is on your first day in the governor's office. You just kind of get thrown in. But it was really meaningful and really, powerful and really impactful legislation that, wasn't perfect because most big pieces of legislation like that aren't in order to get them passed, right? They, that's a whole nother conversation of how that works. But it was, really, really meaningful. And I don't think I ever slept overnight. I mean, definitely really late. That actually, the raise the age year, we left on, we were late that year by a couple days. And I left on like March 31st and was like, it's not happening. We're not getting raised the age. This is over. Everything else in my portfolio was done. I was like out with my dog, and then we get the call, like, we're back at the table on raise the age, come back like right now. Like, and so I came back with my dog because I had to, like, it was like literally like that minute. And I was wearing a flannel shirt and ripped jeans and like sneakers. And I saw the governor in the hallway, and I was so mortified because I had my dog and this outfit that I would never be in front of the governor in. But that was what it is. And that was how I spent the next 18 hours with my dog in my office and in the flannel and ripped jeans.
Do you remember though why that happened? We had passed the extender to go to May. So the whole the whole budget, the whole budget sort of fell apart and cratered. And so the governor's office said to us, like, if you want anything, you will pass this extender. And we were like, we'll pass the extender. So we passed the extender to May, which means, by the way, if the budget is late, legislators do not get paid. So that is a hammer that sort of, so we passed the extender and act like we're going to leave town, which was also, I think, an overnight. And then the assembly came back to the table and said, fine, we'll do the whole package. And so the package literally was the same package that was offered, 72
days,
hours
right.
earlier, but it took the like bluff really of we're going to do the extender till May and go home. I have slept in my office more times than I can count, or not slept in my office and napped. My first year working for the legislature, I remember calling my now husband and saying, I don't have clothes and I have to stay here. So can you please bring me some things to wear tomorrow to session? I think that's hopefully something that people are not doing as much as I had to do. I'll just say on meaningful, my toxic trait is nothing's as good as what I initially thought in my head it was supposed to be. So most of the legislation I've worked on winds up being something that I'm still disappointed in. So
But that's good. It means, you were, that's the price of compromise. That's the price of compromise, right? Right. Both sides are unhappy by a trade. I never slept in my office, but I did have times when I slept at home a little. Most gratifying is easy. I worked for years with the governor and then helped pass and helped implement a law that gave public school choice to kids who cannot afford to move to Scarsdale or Bethlehem or any of the nicer places. They're called charter public schools. The governor was able to do it over the opposition of people who hate it, which is to say we used to be called the blob, the education establishment. And as a result of that, we've had hundreds of thousands of kids in Bed-Stuy and in Harlem and in the Bronx and in Buffalo and in Albany who've had a chance to go to schools that their parents have chosen for them, as opposed to being shipped away to the school that you're assigned to because of your address, no matter how bad it is. And it has primarily been I loved walking through the South Bronx, going to meet with a Latino pastor, going past the city-run school building and going, I can't believe I'm working for a Republican governor who won with conservative backing, and I'm going to meet with this pastor who was part of the civil rights battles in the 60s, and I've got a school for him and his kids. And this was in a place you'd only see if you got lost on the way to Yankee Stadium. Now, the beauty of that, Beth just mentioned how legislators don't get paid. So in basketball, right, you steal the ball from somebody, you score the other way. It's called a 4-point play. This was a great 4-point play because the governor got his charter school bill passed. The legislature wanted its first pay raise in 10 years, and the governor said, that's fine. That's fine. You can have your pay raise. You just got to give me the charter school. And as part of that, the legislature agreed to not get paid if the budget isn't passed. Now they'll get paid at the end, but so governmentally it was great, right? Because we're creating new kinds of schools for kids who don't have any other choice. Politically, it was great because I was working for a Republican governor going into Democratic neighborhoods. It was the ultimate crossover issue. And legislatively, it was great because we stuck it to them real good. And they got a 10% pay raise.
I'll just chime in to say quickly that, at least from my perspective, in 2023, the governor invested $1 billion into the state's mental health system, which no governor had ever done before. So I was fortunate to be on her team for that. Mental health, addiction, not always the most prioritized issues in society. So to see the governor stand in front of the legislature and give a speech that changed the tide of history on that was pretty impactful. I know we talked about, how well are the speeches written, how long are they? For what it's worth, she did get a standing ovation when she mentioned that part of her speech, which you don't necessarily see that much in those settings. So that was a pretty cool thing to be part of.
Amen, brother.
Yeah. I think that we might be done with questions online. Does anyone have any questions in the room? Go for it. And if you don't mind, just can you turn the mic on?
Hello.
Thanks.
So I'm glad you mentioned Article 7 of policy language earlier. And my question is, this year's budget surprisingly has very little Article 7 outside of funding. And I want to know what your opinions are on this politically and internally, and how this will affect how quickly the budget will get passed, considering it has been late for many years.
look, I think politically it's right where she needs to be in an election year. I think it was, she's got her major initiatives, some of which are going to be difficult to get through the legislature. But I do think, more is sometimes just more, and it's not actually, necessarily helping her. So I thought, looking at the budget, it was pretty smart to be balanced and focused where she is just on that. I've got a solid fiscal plan. I have some necessary policy items, and that's it. I'm not loading it up.
All I know about Article 7 is it's a Roman numeral.
Carrie, do you have any thoughts? No. The only thing I would say is, part of it's like it's a very classic law school answer. I'm sure you've heard quite a bit already. Because this is one of our students that asked the question, which is a great question, by the way. So I'm glad you're already up to speed on that. It depends is part of it, right? Because depending on how the legislature comes back, and, she didn't plan to really raise taxes. If the legislature looks to do that, it could change how things look. Remains to be seen. But I think Beth's answer was a really good one. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very, very much to all three of our wonderful panelists. We'll give them a huge round of applause. So thank you so much. And that's it. If you like programs like this, there's some flyers for upcoming programs over here to your left on the way out. And please follow us on social media. That's what the young people, I won't say kids, what the young people use these days. So we are doing that too. But thank you again for coming out and being interested in these processes. So have a good night.